Across the four Gospels, Jesus stops a funeral procession in the middle of the street. He cancels an execution that's already in progress. He breaks the biggest social taboo of his entire culture in public on purpose. He deliberately waits 2 extra days before performing a miracle he could have done immediately. And every single time, it's for a woman. Not a king, not a Pharisee, not even his own mother once, when she waited outside a packed house while he kept teaching inside. By the time this video ends, you will know every recorded moment in the New Testament where Jesus interrupted his own plans for a woman the world around her had already written off. 8 women, 8 interruptions, and underneath every one of them, a single pattern you will not notice until you see all 8 side by side. Here's why this is worth more than Sunday school trivia. If you've ever felt disqualified, too messy, too foreign, too much of a sinner, too old, too invisible, or simply forgotten to matter to God, these 8 accounts are not metaphors somebody made up to teach a lesson. They are historical records of how Jesus actually responded, in real moments, to exactly that kind of person. A woman bleeding for over a decade nobody would touch. A woman from a nation Jews were raised to avoid. A woman dragged in front of a crowd for public execution. A grieving widow with no husband and now no son left to protect her. By the end of this video, you won't just know Bible facts, you'll know precisely what Jesus does the moment he sees someone everyone else has already stopped seeing. And that changes how you read every other page of the Gospels after this one. The first stop is really 2 stops folded into a single story, and it happens in Mark chapter 5. Jairus, a synagogue ruler, a man with enough religious authority that most people in this crowd would never dare interrupt him, falls at Jesus' feet begging him to come heal his dying 12-year-old daughter. Jesus starts walking toward the house immediately, then everything stops. A woman in the crowd had been bleeding for 12 years straight. 12 years of ceremonial uncleanness under Jewish law. 12 years of being unable to touch another person in public without making them unclean, too. And Mark adds one brutal detail: 12 years and every coin she had spent on physicians who only made her condition worse. She doesn't ask Jesus for anything out loud. She just reaches through the crowd, touches the edge of his robe, and believes that's enough. It is. The bleeding stops instantly, and Jesus feels power leave his body and stops walking to ask who touched him. His own disciples think the question is almost absurd, given how many people are pressing in from every side. But Jesus waits until the woman comes forward trembling and tells him the whole truth in front of everyone. He calls her Daughter 1. Of the only times in the Gospels, he uses that word for a woman he's just met, and tells her it was her own faith that made her well. Here's the detail most people skip past completely. While this is happening, messengers arrive to tell Jairus his daughter has already died, so why trouble the teacher any further? Jesus ignores them and keeps walking. A 12-year-old girl and a woman who had suffered for 12 years, both, restored within the same afternoon because Jesus refused to choose between the 2 of them. This is the woman for anyone convinced their suffering has lasted so long that surely no one is still coming. The next one happens in the heat of the day, at a well, and it breaks 3 rules at once. John chapter 4 puts Jesus at Jacob's well, in Samaria, at noon, tired from travel. The well itself carried its own history. Jacob had dug it generations earlier for the family whose 12 sons would eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. A Samaritan woman comes to draw water at the hottest hour of the day, which is already a clue, since most women drew water together in the cool of the morning. She's avoiding people. Jesus asks her for a drink, and that one sentence breaks 3 boundaries of his culture simultaneously. A Jewish man wasn't supposed to speak publicly with a woman he didn't know. Jews and Samaritans had avoided each other for centuries over a religious split neither side had forgiven, and this particular woman had been married 5 times and was currently living with a man who wasn't her husband, which likely made her an outsider, even among outsiders. Jesus doesn't lead with any of that. He offers her water that will end her thirst permanently. When she brings up the Messiah everyone was expecting, Jesus tells her plainly, "I who speak to you am he." That sentence carries more weight than it sounds like. This is the first time in John's entire gospel that Jesus openly states who he is, and he says it to a 5 times divorced Samaritan woman at a well, before he says it to Peter, before he says it to any of the 12 disciples. She leaves her water jar behind, forgetting the very reason she came, and runs to tell her whole town. Many believed because of her testimony alone, John tells us, and Jesus ends up staying 2 extra days because of what one conversation started. This is the woman for anyone who assumes their past disqualifies them from being the person God speaks to first. But the next one isn't a conversation. It's an execution already in progress. John chapter 8 places Jesus in the temple courts one morning when the scribes and Pharisees drag a woman in front of him, caught, they claim, in the very act of adultery. They quote the law of Moses, which does prescribe stoning, and ask what Jesus says about it. It's a trap with no safe answer. Side with mercy, and he contradicts the law. Side with the law, and he contradicts everything he's been teaching about mercy. Jesus doesn't answer right away. He bends down and writes in the dirt with his finger. The only moment in any gospel where Jesus is described writing anything at all, and we're never told what. When they keep demanding an answer, he stands and says one sentence, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone." Then he bends down and writes again. One by one, the accusers walk away. John notes, beginning with the oldest, which tells you something about who in that crowd had lived long enough to know their own record honestly. There's a legal detail buried here, too. Under Jewish law, an execution required at least 2 witnesses willing to stand by their accusation and even cast the first stones themselves. Once every single accuser leaves, there's technically no valid case left standing. When only the woman remains, Jesus asks where her accusers went and whether anyone condemned her. "No one, Lord," she says. "Neither do I condemn you," he answers. "Go and sin no more." He doesn't excuse what she did. He simply refuses to let a crowd stone her for it while he's the one standing there. This is the woman for anyone convinced their worst moment is public record and permanently unforgivable. Stop and notice something already, only 3 stories in. A woman bleeding for over a decade, a woman with 5 ex-husbands, and a 6th man she wasn't married to. A woman 1 stone throw away from death. None of them was someone the religious system of the day would have platformed on purpose. Every one of them had already been filed away as finished, and in every case so far, Jesus isn't the one tolerating an interruption to his schedule. He's the one who stops walking first. Now here's one where Jesus actually says no at first. Matthew 15 and Mark 7 both record Jesus deliberately withdrawing into the region of Tyre and Sidon, Gentile territory, trying, Mark specifically says, to keep his presence secret. It doesn't work. A Canaanite woman, a Gentile with no claim on Israel's covenant at all, finds him and starts shouting for help because her daughter is severely tormented by a demon. His own disciples ask him to send her away since she won't stop crying out after them. Jesus' first response is jarring even reading it now. He says he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, then compares helping her to taking bread meant for children and throwing it to dogs. She doesn't walk away, and she doesn't argue the insult. She takes his own metaphor and turns it back on him. "Yes, Lord," she says, "yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Jesus' response changes completely in the next line. "Woman, great is your faith," he says. "Let it be done for you exactly as you desire." Her daughter is healed in that instant without Jesus ever laying eyes on the girl. Matthew only uses that specific phrase, great faith, twice in his entire gospel, once for this Canaanite mother and once for a Roman centurion, both of them Gentiles standing completely outside the covenant Israel had assumed belonged to them alone. This is the woman for anyone who's been told, directly or quietly, that they don't qualify for the help they're asking for. The next one, Jesus stops a funeral that nobody asked him to stop. Luke chapter 7 places Jesus arriving at the gate of the town of Nain with a large crowd, right as a funeral procession is coming out through that same gate. The body being carried out is a young man, an only son, and Luke adds the detail that explains everything that follows. His mother is a widow, no husband, now no son either. In that culture, a woman with neither was left with almost no legal or financial protection whatsoever. Nobody asks Jesus to step in here. There's no Jairus in this story, no messenger sent ahead to beg for help. Luke simply writes that when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and told her to stop weeping. Then he touches the open coffin, which would make him ceremonially unclean under Jewish law, and the men carrying it stop walking. "Young man," Jesus says, "I say to you, arise." The dead man sits up and starts speaking, and Jesus gives him back to his mother. Luke's exact wording there, "gave him to his mother," echoes almost word for word the ancient account of Elijah raising the widow of Zarephath's son centuries earlier. And Nain sits only a few miles from Shunem, where the prophet Elisha once raised another widow's son back to life. Without saying a single word about it, Jesus places himself in the same line as Israel's greatest prophets. This is the only account in any gospel where Jesus raises someone from the dead without a single person asking him to. This is the woman for anyone who stopped asking for help because they've quietly decided no one is coming. But the next story shows something different. Jesus stopping by waiting. John chapter 11 tells us plainly that Jesus loved Martha, her sister Mary, and their brother Lazarus. So when word reaches him that Lazarus is sick, you'd expect him to drop everything and run. Instead, John says he deliberately stayed 2 more days in the place where he already was. By the time he arrives in Bethany, Lazarus has been dead 4 days. Martha meets him on the road first and says, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus answers with one of the boldest statements in any gospel, "I am the resurrection and the life." And Martha, standing there before her brother is even raised, answers with a confession almost identical to Peter's, later celebrated as the turning point of an entire gospel. "Yes, Lord," she says, "I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." Then Mary comes out, falls at his feet, and says the exact same sentence her sister said moments earlier. Here's what's easy to skip past. Jesus already knows he's about to raise Lazarus within minutes. He knows exactly how this ends, and he weeps anyway. John 11:35, the shortest verse in the entire Bible, just 2 words in English, Jesus wept. Not because he lacked the power to fix it immediately, because he refused to rush past their grief on his way to the miracle. Only after weeping with them does he go to the tomb and call Lazarus back out. This is the story, actually these 2 sisters together, for anyone who assumes God being on his way to fix something means he skips grieving with you first. Now here's one people have been mixing up with someone else for over 1,000 years. Luke chapter 7, earlier in the very same chapter as the widow of Nain, records Jesus at dinner in the home of a Pharisee named Simon. A woman Luke only describes as a sinner from that town hears he's there, brings an alabaster jar of expensive ointment, and stands behind him weeping, wetting his feet with her tears, drying them with her own hair, and pouring out the perfume. Simon thinks to himself that a real prophet would know exactly what kind of woman this is and wouldn't allow the contact. Jesus, who apparently reads private thoughts as easily as public actions, tells a short story about 2 people who owed money to the same creditor, one 500 denarii, roughly 500 days of a laborer's wages, and the other 50, a debt 10 times smaller. Both are forgiven completely. Which one loved the creditor more afterward, Jesus asks. The one forgiven more, Simon answers, correctly walking straight into the point being made. Her sins, which are many, are forgiven, Jesus tells him, for she loved much. And then, in front of the entire dinner party, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. For centuries, church tradition assumed this woman was Mary Magdalene, an identification a pope made official in a homily delivered in the year 591. Most modern scholars now consider that connection a mistake, since Luke, introduces Mary Magdalene as a completely separate person just one chapter later. This is the woman for anyone whose reputation walks into a room before they do and never quite lets them feel welcome once they're there. The last one happens after everything else in the story is already finished. John chapter 20 gives us Mary Magdalene arriving at Jesus' tomb while it's still dark outside, finding the stone rolled away and running to tell Peter and John. Luke earlier tells us this same Mary had once been delivered from 7 demons, which may explain exactly why she's the one who stays at that tomb when everyone else has already gone home. Peter and John come, look inside, and leave. Mary stays behind crying when 2 angels ask her why. She turns around and sees Jesus standing there but doesn't recognize him at all, assuming he must be the gardener until he says exactly one word, her name, Mary. That's the entire moment. She turns and answers, Rabboni, meaning teacher, and Jesus tells her to go and tell the others that he's ascending. In first-century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony wasn't even considered legally valid in court. And yet the resurrected Jesus, at the single most important moment in the entire New Testament, chooses a woman as his very first witness, and sends her to announce it to the actual apostles before he appears to a single one of them himself. Early theologians later gave her a title for exactly that reason, Apostle to the Apostles. This is the woman for anyone still standing outside an empty place in their own life, still crying long after everyone else has given up and gone home. Picture a packed classroom for a second. Half the hands in the room are raised, waving, confident, used to being called on first. And in the back corner, one student sits with their head down, not raising a hand at all, because they've already learned nobody calls on the kid in the back. A good teacher doesn't just answer the loudest hands faster than everyone else. Sometimes a good teacher walks straight past every raised hand in the room, crosses to the far corner, and kneels down next to the one person who stopped expecting to be seen at all. That's not favoritism. That's noticing exactly who actually needed you to walk over. Every woman in this video was, in some real sense, the kid in the back of that room. Unclean, foreign, publicly accused, widowed, grieving, mislabeled by 13 centuries of church tradition, or simply female in a culture where her own testimony wasn't considered admissible in a courtroom. And in every single account, Jesus is the one who crosses the room. Line all 8 of these up side by side, and a pattern appears that you'd never catch reading them scattered across 4 different Gospels written years apart. Every one of these women had already been disqualified by somebody before Jesus ever arrived, disqualified by a disease, by her nationality, by a public accusation, by widowhood, by a reputation, or by nothing more than bad timing at a well at noon. And in every single case, Jesus doesn't just help quietly and move on to the next thing. He stops walking. He breaks a purity law on purpose. He interrupts a formal dinner. He waits 2 extra days when he could have healed instantly. He stands directly in front of a crowd holding stones. And then, almost every time, he does one more thing that's easy to miss entirely. He hands the woman a voice she'd already been denied. He sends the Samaritan woman to speak to her entire town. He tells Simon's dinner guests out loud that her love outweighed his own. He holds up a Gentile mother's faith as the example for his own people to imitate. He makes Mary Magdalene the very first person in history to announce the resurrection in a culture where her word alone wasn't legally supposed to count for anything. The healing was never really the last step in any of these stories. The last step every time is being handed something to say and being trusted to say it. Jesus doesn't just stop for the women everyone else had already stopped listening to. He's the one who hands them the microphone. So here's what this comes down to. 8 women, 8 moments where Jesus had somewhere else to be and stopped anyway. A bleeding woman nobody would touch. A 5 times divorced woman at a well. A woman 1 stone throw from death. A widow nobody thought to ask for help on behalf of. 2 grieving sisters standing in the same doorway. A woman with a jar of perfume and a reputation that walked in before she did, and a woman crying outside. An empty tomb who became the first person in history to say he was alive. If you've ever wondered whether your own story is too messy, too foreign, too old, or too far gone for God to interrupt His plans for you, these 8 accounts are your answer, recorded in His own words and actions. Which one of these did you already know before today? Which one surprised you the most? And is there a woman in the Gospels you think belongs on this list that I didn't mention here? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this helped you see these women differently, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this reach the next person who needs to hear it. God bless you.